Daughter's friend showed up crying with boxes. One look inside and I knew everything. So, my daughter Tina has had this best friend Maya since she was 9. They were practically attached at the hip. Honestly, I don't even remember a time when Maya wasn't around our house. If you came by on any random day, you'd find her there, just as comfortable as Tina. She had her own spot at the dinner table, her own blanket on the couch, and a key to our house. Yeah, a key. I mean, it's not something I do lightly, but Maya was like family to us. At some point, it stopped feeling like Maya was just a friend and more like I had a second daughter. She was there for every little moment, birthday parties, holidays, even our family reunions. And she never just came to hang out with Tina. She'd spend time with all of us. My wife loved having her around, and honestly, I did too. She was just one of those kids who felt like they belonged, you know? Maya had this big, bright personality that filled the room. She was always smiling, always kind, and seemed genuinely grateful to be part of our lives. If Tina was our little spark, Maya was the steady flame. They'd spend hours together, watching movies, talking about school, playing games, or whatever it is that teenage girls do. Their friendship was something I admired. It seemed like it would last forever. Now, Tina and Maya's personalities were a bit different, but they balanced each other out. Tina's more of a dreamer, sometimes a little impulsive, and Maya was the grounded one, the type who'd help Tina think things through. I'd always figured that Maya was a great influence on Tina because, honestly, I could see that my daughter sometimes got lost in her head. Maya was the friend who'd pull her back down to earth, keeping her level-headed. In fact, there were times when Maya would come over to the house even if Tina wasn't around. I'd come home from work, walk in, and there she'd be, chatting with my wife or hanging out with my younger son. At first, I thought it was a little strange, but Maya just fit in so well with all of us. She'd sit there at the kitchen counter, helping with dinner, or even doing her homework while we all went about our evening routine. I don't think any of us ever questioned it. We just accepted it. I mean, what kind of family wouldn't want a kid like her around? As the years went by, it became clear that Maya wasn't just Tina's friend. She was a big part of our family. And we treated her like it. She joined us on every family trip, even the family reunions. I remember one time at a reunion, Maya and Tina were playing some silly game with my younger nieces and nephews, and my mom, Tina's grandma, called Maya her other granddaughter. It was just that natural, like she'd always been part of our family tree. It wasn't only us who saw it this way either. Maya's parents were lovely people, don't get me wrong, but they were always busy. They traveled a lot for work and weren't home much. From what I gathered, they weren't super close to Maya in the way we were with her. I think they liked knowing she had a second family she could rely on. Whenever I'd see them, they'd thank us for taking such good care of Maya and for treating her like one of our own. They were genuinely grateful, and I was happy to do it. Now, if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I don't throw the word family around lightly. But Maya, she earned it. She was around for some tough times too. When my wife had surgery a few years back, Maya was right there helping us out. She'd bring over dinner, help clean up, even took care of the dog for a while. She didn't have to, but she did it because she cared. And it meant the world to us. Then there were the little moments that showed just how close they were. Tina once got really sick, like a bad flu that had her out for days. Maya stayed over for 2 nights just to keep her company, missing school just to make sure her best friend was okay. That's the kind of friend Maya was. She'd sacrifice her time, her own plans, just to be there for Tina and for us. Looking back, maybe I took it all for granted. I mean, I just assumed that friendship would always be there, strong and solid. Tina and Maya used to talk about their future, making plans as if nothing could ever get in the way. They'd dream about going to the same college, maybe even moving to the same city one day. It was a given that they'd always be part of each other's lives. There's something funny about how you can get used to things, and maybe I got too comfortable. I don't think I ever imagined that anything could come between them. As far as I was concerned, Maya was family, and family is supposed to stick together, right? So here's the thing. I didn't see the cracks forming, but now, in hindsight, I wonder if there were small signs. I wonder if there was something more I could have done or noticed. I thought Tina and Maya's bond was unbreakable, that they'd be those lifelong friends you read about. But life has a way of throwing things at you. Things you don't expect. Things you don't want to believe. If I'd known what was coming, maybe I'd have done something different. Maybe I'd have had a conversation with Tina about loyalty, about values. But back then, there was no way I could have known any of this was going to happen. So for those years, Maya was part of us, and we were her second family. I believed in her, trusted her, and I had no reason not to. She'd been there through thick and thin, always a stable presence. I never thought anything could shake that. So, a few months ago, Maya started dating this guy. We'll call him Jake. At first, it seemed pretty typical. She was excited, telling Tina all about him, sharing the little details you'd expect. I remember Tina seemed happy for her, even teasing her about finally getting a boyfriend. It was the usual best friend stuff, you know? No one thought much of it. Now, I'm not one to jump to conclusions or try to read too much into teenage relationships, but there was something about Jake that gave me pause. Maybe it was because I'd gotten so used to Maya just being part of our family, and suddenly she was bringing someone else around, someone who didn't quite fit. I tried not to overthink it though, because Maya was young, and I figured she was just going through that phase. We all do it, right? Where you get swept up in that first serious relationship and want everyone to meet them and like them. At first, Jake only came over once or twice. He seemed polite enough, shaking my hand, making eye contact, all that good stuff. And sure, he was friendly enough, but there was just something about him that felt off to me. I don't know if it was because I was so used to Maya being this open, bubbly person, and Jake felt like this closed book. He'd answer questions, but there wasn't much personality there. Still, I didn't say anything. I figured I didn't know him well enough to judge. But then, a few weeks into their relationship, Jake started coming around more often. He was over at our place so much that I'd bump into him in the kitchen or the living room. And I'll be honest, I wasn't exactly thrilled. I guess part of me was protective of Maya, even though I had no real reason to be. She was a smart girl, had a good head on her shoulders, and it wasn't my place to meddle. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And it wasn't just about Jake, it was also about Tina. I noticed this shift in her, like she'd suddenly become hyper-aware every time he was around. She'd glance his way a little too often, and sometimes I'd catch her staring, almost like she was lost in thought. I thought, okay, maybe she has a bit of a crush. I mean, they're teenagers. It's not the most shocking thing in the world. She was probably just curious about him since he was Maya's boyfriend, and that's normal, right? I brushed it off. But then, these little things started piling up. I'd be sitting in the living room watching TV, and I'd notice Tina practically hovering whenever Jake was around. At one point, she even changed her clothes before coming downstairs, which she'd never done before. That was when I started feeling uneasy, though I still wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. One evening, Maya, Jake, and Tina were all hanging out in the backyard, laughing and talking. I glanced out the window, and something about the way Tina looked at Jake stuck with me. It wasn't the look of someone who's just casually curious. It was that look that teenagers get when they're infatuated. She was smiling, but it was this smile that had a bit too much to it. And Jake? He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. He kept talking to Maya, not a clue on his face. It was one of those moments where I felt like a bystander, just observing something that didn't quite sit right. I didn't want to interfere because at this point, there was nothing concrete, just a weird vibe. But the vibe was strong enough that I started keeping an eye on things a bit more closely. I mean, I didn't think Tina would cross any lines. She'd never shown me anything that would make me think otherwise. But teenage feelings can be complicated, and sometimes good kids do things that surprise you. After that night, I started seeing little things that maybe wouldn't seem like much on their own. Tina would find excuses to be around Maya and Jake when they were at our place. Even if she didn't have a reason to be in the same room, she'd just sort of be there. And when Jake spoke, I'd catch her listening a bit too intently, like she was hanging on to every word. It wasn't blatant or anything that anyone else would pick up on, but I'm her dad, so maybe I was just tuned in a bit more. I'll admit it bugged me. I didn't want to see my daughter falling for her best friend's boyfriend. That's a line you just don't cross. But at the same time, I couldn't exactly sit her down and say, "Hey, quit staring at Maya's boyfriend." She wasn't doing anything wrong, at least not technically. So I just kept watching, hoping this crush would fizzle out on its own. One night, Jake was over again, and he and Maya were sitting on the couch watching a movie. Tina was sitting on the armchair, and I could tell her attention was more on Jake than on whatever was happening on the screen. She kept glancing his way, almost like she was trying to make sense of him. I remember thinking, this isn't good. I started debating whether I should say something to her, maybe just pull her aside and remind her that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, even if they feel harmless. But then I thought, maybe I'm overthinking this. I mean, kids have crushes all the time, and most of them don't mean anything. They just come and go, and in the grand scheme of things, they're not a big deal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something here was different. Tina's interest in Jake didn't feel like a passing phase. It felt more intentional. And that was what worried me. Looking back, maybe I should have trusted my gut and had that talk with her right then. Maybe it would have made a difference. But hindsight's 20/20ths, and at the time, I just kept telling myself it was a harmless crush. I figured she'd get over it. Jake would just be a temporary distraction and things would go back to normal. So I let it be. I told myself it was just teenage curiosity and that Tina knew better. After all, she had grown up with Maya as her best friend. She knew what loyalty looked like. I believed that no matter what was going on in her head, she'd never actually let it get out of hand. Funny how things you convince yourself of can sometimes be so far from reality. So one day, out of nowhere, Maya shows up at our house like a storm. And I mean, it was intense. She came tearing down the driveway, slammed on the brakes, and before I knew it, she'd hit the corner of our garage. I remember hearing this loud bang from inside, and my first thought was, what in the world is happening? I didn't even know it was Maya at first. I just heard this loud crunch and figured someone had a bad day on the road. I rushed outside, and there she was, just standing next to her car, looking like she'd been through hell and back. Her face was pale, her hands were shaking, and her eyes were red like she'd been crying for hours. She looked like she could barely hold herself together. The part that really got me, though, was the car itself. Her backseat was packed with boxes, and when I looked closer, I noticed they were full of Tina's things. Things from years ago. Stuff I hadn't seen in ages. Now I didn't know what was going on yet, but I could tell this was serious. Maya's the kind of person who keeps it together, and I'd never seen her look like that. She was a wreck, and whatever happened, it was bad enough that she'd decided to bring over boxes of Tina's old things and leave them here, as if she was done. I walked up to her, trying to keep my voice calm, and asked, "Maya, what's going on? Are you okay?" She just shook her head, didn't say a word, and for a second I thought she might just collapse right there. I took her by the shoulders and guided her inside. She didn't resist, didn't say anything, just followed me, dragging herself along like every step took all the energy she had left. Once we were in the kitchen, I sat her down and made her a cup of tea. I didn't want to push her to talk. I could see she needed a minute. She just sat there, staring at the table, not touching her tea, her hands still trembling. I kept glancing at her, waiting for her to say something, anything. The whole time I was racking my brain trying to figure out what could have happened between her and Tina. They'd been like sisters for so long, and now Maya looked like she'd just lost a part of herself. After a few minutes, she finally looked up at me. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "Did you know?" I had no idea what she was talking about, so I just looked at her, confused. She took a deep breath and then, slowly, she started telling me everything. Apparently, she'd found out that Tina had been hooking up with Jake, her boyfriend, the guy she'd trusted. She told me she found out by accident, a voicemail that Tina left on Jake's phone. Tina, my own daughter, had left a voicemail for Jake, not realizing Maya would hear it. I felt a chill go down my spine just hearing it. Maya's face was twisted with pain as she explained, and I could see how much it was taking out of her to tell me this. At that moment, I didn't know what to say. I was too stunned to even process it. Tina, my daughter, who I thought knew better than to hurt her best friend, had been sneaking around with the guy Maya cared about. It felt like a punch to the gut, and I could only imagine how Maya was feeling, having to confront this betrayal from both her boyfriend and her best friend. Maya was holding herself together as best as she could, but she was barely hanging on. I reached out, put my hand on hers, and tried to offer some kind of comfort, but I could tell she was shattered. She told me she'd found out the day before, that she hadn't been able to sleep, that she'd been going over and over it in her mind, trying to make sense of how this could have happened. It was a mess, and it was so much worse than I'd ever imagined. I kept thinking back to those moments I'd noticed Tina acting strange around Jake, all the little signs I'd ignored or brushed off as teenage crushes. I felt sick with guilt, like I should have seen this coming and somehow stopped it. Maya went on to say that she'd tried to talk to Jake about it, tried to get him to explain himself, but he didn't have much to say. He'd barely apologized, just brushed it off as a mistake, and told her not to make a big deal out of it. Maya told me that hearing that from him hurt almost as much as finding out about the affair. It was like he didn't even care, didn't see how deeply he'd hurt her. And as for Tina, well, Maya hadn't spoken to her yet. She couldn't bring herself to face her. By this point, I could tell Maya had said all she could, and she was just sitting there, looking drained, like she had nothing left in her. I helped her carry the boxes from her car into our garage, and she left, barely saying a word. After she drove off, I stood there in the garage, staring at those boxes. It felt surreal seeing all these little things that belonged to Tina from when she and Maya were kids. Old toys, trinkets, photos, little mementos they'd collected over the years. I remembered Maya bringing over that stuffed bear for one of Tina's birthdays, and now here it was, tossed into a box, like it was just some meaningless item. It was like Maya was trying to erase every memory they'd made together, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I stayed in that garage for a long time, thinking. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, disappointment, sadness. It was all there, tangled up in one big mess. I couldn't shake the image of Maya's face, how devastated she'd looked. She wasn't just losing a boyfriend, she was losing a best friend, someone she'd grown up with, someone she trusted. And knowing that my daughter was the cause of that pain, it was hard to stomach. When I finally walked back into the house, my wife could tell something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to explain just yet. I needed time to wrap my head around what I'd just heard. I needed to figure out how I was going to confront Tina and what I was even going to say. Because whatever had happened, I knew one thing for sure. Things were never going to be the same. I had no idea how I was going to confront Tina. I felt like my head was spinning just thinking about it. How do you even bring something like this up? I spent the whole night going over what Maya had told me, piecing together the little things I'd noticed but brushed off. The glances, the way Tina acted whenever Jake was around, it all came rushing back, clear as day now. I felt sick thinking about it, knowing I'd ignored my gut when it was practically screaming at me. The next evening, when Tina got home, I knew it was time. She walked in, all smiles, acting like nothing was wrong. I could feel this heavy pit in my stomach. I didn't want to believe my own daughter could do something like this to her best friend. It was like there were two sides of me clashing, the father who'd always been proud of his kid, and the guy who'd just heard something he couldn't ignore. I told her we needed to talk, and she just looked at me, a little confused, maybe even nervous. She sat down across from me in the kitchen, and for a second I felt like I was about to have one of those regular dad talks about school or curfew. But this wasn't anything like that, so I just came out with it. I said, "Tina, I need to know what's going on with you and Jake." For a second she froze. Her smile faded, and there was this flicker in her eyes, something like fear or guilt. It was quick, but I caught it. She tried to brush it off, playing innocent. "What do you mean, Dad?" she asked, sounding all casual, like she didn't have a clue what I was talking about, but I wasn't having it. I told her I'd spoken to Maya, that Maya had come over in tears, telling me everything she'd found out. Tina's face went pale, and I could see her confidence slipping. She looked down at the table, avoiding my eyes, and I could tell she was piecing together how much I knew. After a moment of silence, she muttered, "I didn't mean for it to happen." I remember feeling my chest tighten. She didn't deny it. She didn't try to defend herself. She just sat there, looking almost defeated. I couldn't believe it. My own daughter, who I'd raised to be kind and respectful, had betrayed her best friend. And now she was sitting in front of me, not even denying it. "Do you have any idea what you did to Maya?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to yell. I wanted her to understand the gravity of what she'd done. "She trusted you. You were like sisters." She finally looked up, and there were tears in her eyes. "I know, Dad. I know I messed up, but I love him." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I could feel my patience slipping away. I was stunned. "Love him? Tina, you think that makes this okay? You think saying you love him justifies hurting Maya like this?" She looked at me with this desperate, pleading expression, like she was hoping I'd somehow understand. But I couldn't. I didn't. "I didn't plan for this to happen," she whispered. We got close, and it happened. I couldn't help it." I could barely contain my frustration. "Couldn't help it? Tina, you made a choice. Every time you met him, every time you texted him behind Maya's back, you chose to keep doing it. That wasn't an accident." She started to cry, and for a second, I almost felt bad. Almost. But then I thought about Maya. How she'd been there for Tina through everything. How she'd come to me completely shattered. I couldn't let myself feel sorry for Tina right now. "What happens now then?" I asked her, trying to get her to see the consequences of all this. "Are you just going to stay with him? Keep acting like what you did doesn't matter?" Tina looked down again, her hands clenched on the table. She wiped her eyes and finally said, "I don't know. I feel like if I leave him, then everything I did was for nothing. I've already hurt Maya. It's too late to fix that. But if I don't stay with him, then I ruined 2 relationships for no reason." Her words hit me like a slap. It was like she was admitting she'd done something terrible but was still trying to rationalize it. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "So you're staying with him out of guilt?" I asked, shaking my head. "That's how you're justifying this?" She didn't answer, just sat there in silence, and I could feel this wave of disappointment wash over me. I'd expected her to show some real remorse, some understanding of what she'd done. But instead, it was like she was trying to reason it away, like staying with Jake somehow made it less wrong. "Tina, you can't just move on like nothing happened," I told her. "Maya was your best friend. You can't undo what you did, but you could at least show her some respect by admitting you were wrong. This whole thing, it's selfish, and it's cruel." She started crying harder, covering her face with her hands. But I wasn't in a place to comfort her. I couldn't just brush this under the rug and act like everything would be fine. Seeing her like this, seeing how she'd justified everything to herself, made me realize just how far she'd strayed from the person I thought she was. After a long silence, I finally said, "You need to make things right with Maya. I don't care how hard it is or how awkward it might be. You owe her an apology at the very least. She deserves that much." Tina nodded, but it was a weak nod, like she was only agreeing because she knew I wouldn't let it go. I felt drained, disappointed, and honestly, heartbroken. This wasn't the kid I'd raised, the girl I'd spent all these years being proud of. I didn't know who she was right now, but I knew that I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. I stood up, feeling this heavy weight in my chest, and told her, "I hope you think long and hard about this, Tina, because I don't know if Maya will ever forgive you. And honestly, I don't know if I can either." With that, I walked out, leaving her sitting alone in the kitchen. The silence in the house was deafening, and I could feel this ache deep in my chest. I'd never imagined I'd be so disappointed in my own child that she'd turn into someone I didn't even recognize. As I went upstairs, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I'd missed something along the way, something that could have stopped all this from happening. But it was too late for that now. A few months had passed since everything went down with Tina and Maya, but things hadn't exactly gone back to normal. Our family was still shaken up from the whole mess, and honestly, I was still struggling to look at Tina the same way. She was my kid, and I loved her, but this situation was like a dark cloud hanging over us. Around that time, we were getting ready for a big family vacation. We'd planned it months in advance, a trip to a beach resort where we could all unwind, relax, and just enjoy some time together. I'd been looking forward to this trip for a long time. My wife and I had saved up, booked a nice place, and arranged everything so that the whole family could have a great time. And by whole family, I mean everyone but Tina's boyfriend, Jake. I knew this decision would stir things up, but I didn't care. I couldn't stand the idea of being around that guy, acting like he hadn't played a part in tearing our family apart. My other kids were bringing their partners, and normally I'd have been fine with that, but this wasn't a normal situation. I didn't want to spend a single minute of my vacation looking at Jake, being reminded of everything that had happened. So I told Tina straight up. Her boyfriend wasn't invited. She looked at me like I'd just told her we were canceling Christmas. At first, she seemed stunned, like she couldn't believe what I was saying. Then slowly, her expression shifted from shock to anger. "What? Are you serious, Dad?" she asked, her voice already shaking with frustration. "You're really not going to let him come?" I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Yes, I'm serious. I don't want him there, Tina. I want this to be a peaceful trip, and having him around isn't going to make that happen." She stared at me, probably waiting for me to back down, but I held my ground. I could see the frustration building up in her, and I knew this was going to be a fight. But I wasn't about to bend on this one. I'd already compromised enough, trying to let her figure things out after what she did. But this trip was supposed to be a chance to reconnect as a family, and I wasn't going to ruin it just to make her feel comfortable. "You're punishing me," she said, her voice getting louder. "This is ridiculous. When are you going to forgive me, Dad? It's been months. When are you going to stop holding this over my head?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm, but her words stung. I told her, "Tina, this isn't just about punishment, this is about choices. You made your choice to be with him. I'm making mine by not inviting him on this trip. It would be one thing if you'd made a mistake and tried to make things right, but you're still with him. That shows me you don't even feel sorry for what happened." She was fuming at this point, pacing back and forth, her hands clenched into fists. "You're acting like I don't care. But I do, Dad. I messed up, okay? But I can't just stop seeing him. I can't pretend he doesn't matter to me." I felt a mixture of frustration and disappointment boiling up. "Tina, you can be with him if that's what you want, but don't expect me to welcome him with open arms. This trip is for our family, and I don't want him there." She started crying, which only made me feel worse, but I couldn't let myself cave. "When are you going to let this go?" she asked, her voice breaking. "When are you going to stop treating me like the bad guy?" I shook my head, feeling more exhausted than ever. "Tina, you made a choice that hurt a lot of people, especially Maya, and now you're choosing to stay with him, even after everything that happened. I'm not saying you're a bad person, but you have to understand that your actions have consequences. This is one of them." She looked at me with this mix of anger and hurt, and for a second, I almost felt like I was looking at a stranger. I didn't recognize this version of my daughter, this person who couldn't see beyond her own feelings. "But everyone else gets to bring their partners," she argued, her voice sounding more desperate now. Why am I the only one who doesn't get to bring someone? Because none of them did what you did, Tina, I replied, my voice calm but firm. You can't just pretend like this didn't happen. Actions have consequences, and this is one of them. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, and I was left sitting there, feeling drained. I hated how things had come to this, how our once close relationship had turned into this tense, uncomfortable mess. I wanted to forgive her, to move past this, but every time I tried, I'd think about Maya's face that day she came over, broken and lost. I'd think about how my daughter was the reason for that pain, and it was like a wall went up between us. The days leading up to the trip were tense, to say the least. Tina barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was short and cold. I could tell she was still holding out hope that I'd change my mind. But I wasn't about to budge. This was a line I couldn't cross, no matter how much it hurt. On the day we left, Tina was sulking, sitting in the back of the car with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed out the window. My other kids were chatting, excited about the trip, but Tina sat there in silence, like she was in her own world. Part of me wanted to say something to try and fix things, but I knew there was nothing I could say that would change how she felt. She was angry, and honestly, I understood why, but that didn't mean I was going to let her walk all over me just because she didn't like my decision. When we got to the resort, Tina kept to herself for most of the trip, only joining us for meals and the occasional family activity. She'd show up, put on a polite smile, and then slip back into that cold, distant attitude. It hurt seeing her like that, knowing our relationship had been so damaged. But I still felt like I'd made the right call. I wasn't about to let one bad decision wreck this trip for everyone. In the end, the vacation was nice, but there was always that tension lingering in the background. Every time I looked at Tina, I could feel it, this unspoken frustration between us. I knew things wouldn't go back to normal anytime soon, but I hoped that maybe, just maybe, she'd come to understand why I'd done what I did. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was trying to set a boundary, to show her that actions have consequences, even if they're uncomfortable. After the vacation, the tension between Tina and me didn't go away. It just got worse. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was short, almost cold. My wife, trying to play peacemaker, finally sat me down and told me, "You need to talk to her. This can't go on." I knew she was right, so the next day I waited until Tina got home and asked her if we could talk. She looked annoyed, but she sat down, arms crossed, clearly ready to defend herself. "Look, Tina," I started, "I don't want this to keep going on like this. You're my daughter, and I hate feeling like there's this huge wall between us." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You built that wall, Dad. You act like I'm the only one holding a grudge, but you're the one still punishing me." Her words stung, but I kept my tone calm. "This isn't about punishment. You hurt someone you were close to, someone who trusted you, and then you stayed with him like it didn't matter. It's hard for me to just look past that." She looked away, clearly frustrated. "I know I messed up, but I care about him, Dad. I'm not with him to hurt Maya. I'm with him because I actually like him." I took a deep breath. "I get that. But you have to understand, from my perspective, it feels like you chose him over a friendship you had for years. You can't just pretend this didn't happen." Tina hesitated, then said, "I tried reaching out to Maya after it happened. Tried to apologize, but she doesn't want anything to do with me. And that's her right. But it hurts. And Jake? He's the only thing that makes it hurt a little less." Hearing her say that threw me off. I'd always seen her staying with Jake as selfish, but maybe it was more complicated than that. Maybe she was just trying to hold on to something that made the fallout easier to handle. It didn't make it okay, but it made me understand her side a little better. "I get that this has been hard for you too," I said finally, "but you have to accept that Maya may never forgive you. I want to be here for you, but I need to feel like you're learning from this." She nodded slowly, her expression softening a bit. It wasn't a fix, but it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt like we might actually find a way through this mess. "Thanks, Dad," she said quietly before heading upstairs. It was just a small gesture, but it gave me a sliver of hope. We still had a long way to go, but I was willing to try if she was. Update. A few weeks after our talk, things were finally starting to feel a bit more normal. Tina wasn't back to her old self, and we weren't magically close again, but at least we were talking. I could see she was making an effort, and so was I. It felt like we'd both accepted that it'd take time to really move forward. Then, one night, she came home looking completely shattered. I could tell she'd been crying. Her eyes were red, makeup smudged, and she just looked defeated. She didn't even make it to her room. She sat down at the kitchen table and just stared at the wall, like she was trying to hold herself together. I asked if she was all right, even though I knew the answer. After a long silence, she finally muttered, "Jake cheated on me." She looked down, embarrassed and hurt, like she didn't want to say it out loud but needed to get it off her chest. Hearing it hit me harder than I expected. I felt angry for her, disappointed, and honestly a bit speechless. All I could think was, of course he did. I wanted to say something comforting, but nothing really felt right. She started talking, her voice shaky. He'd been acting weird for a while, and I guess I ignored it. I thought maybe he was just stressed. But then today he slipped up. I found out he's been seeing someone else. She stopped, and I could see the weight of it sinking in for her. He's been lying to me this whole time. I didn't say, "I told you so," but I think she could see it in my face. Instead, I just put a hand on her shoulder. "I'm really sorry, Tina," I said, and I meant it. I knew that in her own way she cared about him, and this was hitting her hard. Tina shook her head, wiping her eyes. Maybe I deserved it," she whispered, like she was struggling to even believe what she was saying. I didn't agree with that. Sure, she'd made mistakes, but nobody deserves to go through this. "Look, Tina," I said, "you didn't deserve this. You learned something tough, and you'll grow from it. But don't think you brought this on yourself. What he did says more about him than it does about you." She nodded, looking a bit more at peace. It wasn't an easy lesson, but maybe, just maybe, it was one she needed.